Well, thank you very much. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be here, particularly because I like to think we are honoring Ned. And I was thinking, even as we were having dinner the other night, that back in 1965, when I moved from maths to economics, the first paper I was asked to read by my mentor and teacher, Jim Merlees, was a paper, short paper. And he said, well, you won't need to know much economics to be able to read this. Now, I didn't quite know what he meant, but it was the most elegant piece of work, one of the most elegant pieces of work I've ever read. It was almost a transcendental problem, and the author knew it, talked about the golden rule. And it was utterly simple and was connected to economics, even although the question was transcendental. So I read that and I thought, if this is economics, it's for me. Because it has the transcendental aspect, and yet it gives you some firm conclusions which you can use. And of course, disappointment set in pretty quickly after that. But my admiration for Ned has never abated. And I like to think that somewhere a good deal of my work on growth and development economics and the economics of poverty was inspired by his style of thinking, not necessarily the execution, because I moved in a very different direction. I like to think that what I'll be talking about now today complements much of Ned's early work in macroeconomics of the long run. And I am talking about the long run, and I want to first part concentrate on the global issues, and then you'll see how I naturally move to certain local problems. Now, it's not common to find a connection between the earth sciences and economics, but I pride myself in thinking that I have discovered one. From 1950 to 2020, the post-war period, this chunk of 70 years, has been absolutely extraordinary by any standard. Jeff Sachs pointed to a much longer spell of time in his talk, but even that growth is nothing like the last 70 years, and that has colored our perception of economic possibilities in a powerful way, and I'll be arguing in a very misleading way. Look at some of the statistics. Global GDP has increased more than 15-fold to over $120 trillion PPP. Per capita global GDP has increased more than 5-fold to some $20,000 PPP. Population has increased more than 3-fold from 2.5 billion in 1950 to 8 billion now. Life expectancy at birth has increased from 46 years to 72 years, and the proportion of people in extreme poverty has declined from more than 60% to less than 10%. Now, these are glorious pieces of information. I'm looking at the global figures now. I'm not talking about inequality. We have had a lot on that. I'm averaging it up and thinking in terms of the performance of the average person, if you like. Okay? 1950, however, was also the year which has now been officially declared by leading earth scientists as the year we entered the Anthropocene, that is the human-dominated biosphere. They did that by, what they do is, of course, to look at the signatures, geophysical signatures in the soils, in the water, in the oceans, in the atmosphere, and so forth, and look at the concentration that has. So this huge, enormous success we've had in the statistics, as indicated in the statistics I've just quoted, has been achieved by an accumulation of produced capital, roads, buildings, ports, machines, and human capital, health, education, skills, and character is something I'd like to add. I have, but I forgot to type it in for this, because the character marries what I'm talking about with some of the earlier lectures we had this morning. but it has been accompanied by the accumulation of natural capital, wetlands, grasslands, mangroves, coral reefs, woodlands, forests, lakes, and such biomes as the atmosphere, the oceans, the soils, and the subsoil resources. As an indication of, that was an assertion, the decumulation. So let me give you some crude statistics on it. And the statistics are crude not only because it's extremely difficult, because of the heterogeneity of the Earth system and absence of prices in the market for so many of these goods and services, but also because economists have neglected these issues far more than they should have. So that everything is now really exploratory. The applied apparatus that we have in hand is exploratory in a way that, say, the kind of standard statistics in macroeconomics that we are familiar with hasn't, because there have been years and years and decades of work, millions of dollars of expenditure in refining the statistics. As an indication of this assertion that there's been a decumulation of natural capital, look at the rate of species extinction. It's estimated to be about 100 to 1,000 times the background rate of extinction of some 0.1 to 1 species per million per year. That's a huge increase. And you might say, well, I'm talking about wetlands and grasslands, mangroves, and now I'm talking about species, but there's a connection. That is to say, the productivity of ecosystems has been shown as one of the great achievements of contemporary ecology, to be positively contributed by not so much species diversity, but functional diversity of species. Okay? By one UN estimate, and here's another one, globally the stock of produced capital per capita doubled in the period 1992 to 2014. Human capital per capita increased by some 20%, but natural capital per capita declined by 40%. And here is the diagram which shows that. Now, the reason it's worth pondering over this is that, of course, the bottom curve, the one which has declined per capita natural capital, and we can go into how that's measured subsequently, but not quite yet. It's ideas to somehow value these natural assets, the ones I mentioned, attributing them to them accounting prices, not market prices. Everything I'll be talking about today is about accounting prices, largely because, of course, market prices are missing for many, many of these natural products. The reason it's worth pondering it is that the conventional measures that we use for judging the progress or regress of economies doesn't have depreciation in it. GDP, the rogue word in GDP is gross. It doesn't net out the depreciation of capital that accompanies production. So those successes that we looked at, the terms of GDP per capita, GDP in aggregate, didn't include in it the fact that in the process of this great success during the Anthropocene, last 70 years, we have been mining nature, trashing her. Okay. As GDP does not record depreciation of capital, growth and development economics and the economics of poverty should instead be built on the principle of asset management. And in a review that I produced for the UK government 2.5 years ago, and it will be published by Cambridge University Press next spring, I essentially tried to redirect growth and development economics and the economics of poverty towards the viewpoint that we are all asset managers, and we ought to recognize it as so. When I say we all, everybody, but everybody. The poorest household is managing its assets, the fisherman is managing his assets, the farmer is, and so are we. And assets mean, of course, stocks of capital. So we ought to move from flows, which is flow measures like GDP, to measures of stock. And the indicator that we need to use in order to judge the progress or regress of an economy should be an inclusive measure of wealth, again, using accounting prices, okay? That is to say the value, total value of the stocks of produced natural and human capital. Now, you might think that I've skipped social capital, an issue that cropped up earlier this morning. in the context of the family, in the form of connections, and so forth. I haven't missed it out. The reason I haven't included it is that one could, in principle, do so, but in practice, it'll be absolutely impossible. Try and figure out the social, shadow accounting price of a household, as a household, as a unit, as a network. What they do is these intangible capital assets, like financial capital, for example, will be reflected, and the quality of those assets will be reflected in the accounting prices for produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. So an economy in which citizens trust one another will have a different set of accounting prices for the same quantities of these three types of capital assets as one which didn't, where there was discord. So these prices are carrying a huge amount of ethical and factual aspects, okay? Now the question is, I've just asserted inclusive wealth. The question is why? Why should we use it? And there's a theorem behind it. I'm a theorist, so just like there is a number that was the great lecture we just heard, econometrics, and this is theoretical. Inclusive wealth corresponds to well-being across the generations. In other words, you give me a conception of well-being across the generations, whether it's utilitarian, deontological, doesn't matter, whatever it is, there corresponds a set of accounting prices for this bundle of assets, such that if you estimate inclusive wealth, then it corresponds to the conception of intergenerational well-being in the following sense. If the former increases over a period of time, so does the latter. And if the latter increases for a period of time, so does the former. It's an equivalence result. Now, in other words, we should be measuring the wealth of nations, not the GDP of nations or the Human Development Index of nations. That's for sure. The trouble is, that's a Platonic idea. It's not going to happen. You can't possibly do it. There's just too much of heterogeneity in natural capital, even if you could swallow the idea that you can have accounting prices for buildings and roads and human capital and so forth. In natural capital, it's going to be proved extremely difficult. So what's the advantage of having a theorem? In my judgment, the reason theorists like myself are concerned with having theorems of this kind, of this pristine form, is that they tell you what we ought to be ideally seeking. Therefore, the moment we know it, we then start cutting corners, because we know it can't be achieved. But the cutting of the corners will be informed by the fact that you are cutting a corner. If you don't have a theorem, what you will be doing is to just beg, borrow, and steal from everything that you feel is worthwhile in life and put that in and saying that constitutes welfare. And then you run with that. So I'm now going to spend the rest of the time speaking to one aspect of this inclusive wealth and concentrate on that. The biosphere is a self-regenerative asset, supplying us with a variety of services. Ecologists have concentrated on two partitioned nature's goods and services into two forms. I'm using nature and biosphere interchangeably. Sometimes I call her Mother Nature, because of my family background, I guess. One is the provision in goods. These are food, water, timber, fibers, pharmaceutical products, and non-living material. In fact, these are the goods which, with human ingenuity, we convert into what we call GDP. And that's been the point of focus of much of resource economics. Jeff Heel, who's here, my friend Jeff Heel and I wrote a book in 1979 concentrating on provisional goods, but the focus of attention in provisional good there was exhaustible resources, and then blending it into macroeconomics of growth and development. But there's another class of services, or goods, but services. I'm making a distinction between goods and services here, which ecologists call regulating and maintenance services. Climate regulation, decomposition of waste, nitrogen fixation, air and water purification, soil regeneration, and pollination. These are amongst there's a lot more, but the difference between the two is really startling. And ecologists didn't really make much use of it. They recognized, they made the classification, but they didn't run with it. And what I'm going to be doing now is to show the central importance of this distinction. We have increasingly drawn on nature's regulating and maintenance services to provide ourselves with provisioning goods. These regulating and maintenance services are if you like, the basis on which the provisioning goods are, the mechanisms by which the provisioning goods are supplied by Mother Nature. Mathematically, you might want, if you want to think of the processes as being governed by differential equations, if you like, over time, then provisioning, we are looking at stocks of capital, which is I've been hinting at, I've been talking about, natural capital, but the functional forms which transform stocks of, today's stocks of natural capital into tomorrow's stocks of natural capital, that are the processes. So that's the way to think about it. These are the functional forms. They're actually driving the movement of the natural capital stocks. Okay? So that's one big difference. So we've increasingly drawn on these services to provide ourselves with provisioning goods by mining, quarrying, and otherwise transforming the landscape. As you transform the landscape to get, say, more of one type of provisioning goods, you forego some others. And of course, it's disrupting the processes themselves because the ecosystems are specified. The grassland offers a different sort of process, underlying different sorts of processes from a rainforest, from a mangrove forest, or from a coral reef, for that matter. So forests making way for agriculture and plantations, grasslands transferring to pasture lands are examples of land use changes which have been carrying out at a furious rate during the Anthropocene. There is an inevitable tension between provisioning goods on the one hand and regulating maintenance services on the other. And that's the tension that I mentioned. The more you want the provisioning goods, you're going to be eating into the regulating and maintenance services, unless technological change comes in, and I'll come back to that, okay, our ways of doing things. But regulating and maintenance services are fundamental, without which we would have no provisioning goods. A second importance in the distinction lies in the fact that if you concentrate attention on provisioning goods, which the economics of climate change has, you're drawn towards the possibility of substitution possibilities. In fact, Jeff Fields and my book essentially drew attention to the substitution possibilities as a way of getting out of resource scarcities, and that was exactly correct. Unfortunately, in the case of maintenance and regulating services, those services are complementary to one another. They're not substitutable. You can't say I'm going to have a lot more of one type of service at the expense of the other, because they're coupled differential equations, remember. So it'll be disrupting the others as well. And that causes difficulties, serious difficulties, and our conceptual framework. So the idea that we can substitute our way out of resource constraint may be true in the case of provisioning goods up to a point, cleaner energy for dirty energy, that sort of thing, the sources of energy being different. But at the end of the day, they will all be eating into the maintenance and regulating services, and there the substitution possibilities are really very scarce. They are, in fact, complementary. Now, the global demand, and I've been concentrating, I've moved away from inclusive wealth. Why? Because I'm going to be decomposing it and looking at one component of it, having noted that, first of all, that it's such a Platonic notion that we should be seeking to unravel it. And I'm unraveling only one bit of it, which is, if I were a human capital expert, I would be unraveling the human capital component, but I'm not, so I'm not. Okay. The global demand for the human economy makes of maintenance and regulating services has in recent decades outstripped nature's ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. By one estimate, using land use changes for estimating changes in the flow of these services, the global demand today exceeds nature's ability to meet that demand on a sustainable basis. The ratio is 1.7, from which you now and then read we need 1.7 Earths to satisfy our requirements. Notice it's the sustainable basis. At any moment, of course, we can get away with 1.7 excess, but we do that by shrinking, creating a deteriorated biosphere. So the image here, the one I like to use, is it carries you, this imagery carries you so far, not completely, and I'll come back to that, but for the moment, think of this as a fishery. There is a reproductive rate, regeneration rate for the stock of fish. You can cull more than the net reproduction rate, but if you do that, the stock declines. So think of it that way. And that's essentially what's happening. So armed with that, I'm going to write down, I'm a theorist, so if you thought I was going to run away without an equation or an inequality, you would be surprised. So I would be surprised, so here we are. So I look at the demand, think of the demand for these regulating and maintenance services. By the way, I could tell the story in terms of provisioning goods also. I'm going to be concentrating on the other, because remember, the two are connected. So what goes for one goes for the other as well. If demand exceeds supply for the provisioning goods, we have a problem. We'll have to constantly eating into that, or if the demand goes for maintenance and regulating services, it eats into the provisioning goods. So what I want to do is to convert the human activities into the demand that we make, and then connect it with the supply source. And I'm going to do that in a very simplified form for our purposes, imagining that we have accounting prices so that we can aggregate all the way through. If you don't like the idea, and I don't either, then the inequality I'll be giving you will be a series of inequality, one per service. A bit like these planetary boundaries literature that the earth scientists have been talking about, which is a set of thresholds that we mustn't cross. So, but I'm going to be concentrating on an aggregate form. So I'm going to suppose that the total human activity can be expressed in terms of global GDP. We know it can't for reasons that were made clear earlier. Many things are missing in GDP. It doesn't matter. So long as I can concentrate on this, but you'll see I'll have a parameter which will be able to convert the misspecification. So if n is global population, small y is per capita global GDP, the product of the two is global GDP itself. And I'm going to be thinking of a parameter alpha, which is the efficiency with which biosphere's goods and services are converted into global GDP. That's going to be the critical thing. This alpha captures both technological possibilities, which was at the center of the discussions earlier this morning, but of course it also includes institutions. Okay, and I'll come back to this linkage. So alpha, if you like, is arrived at, is reflecting both the institutional structures of the economy in question, and they need not be optimal by any means. It could be an imperfect economy as much as you like. And of course, we are looking at a very imperfect economy. We've got an overshoot to explain and work with, okay? So ny divided by alpha is the demand we make on the alpha has the dimensions so that the left-hand side ny divided by alpha is the units are the aggregate of services. That exceeds the production of the service by Mother Nature, which is G of S. If S is the stock, G is the functional form of which yields the services, hence the allusion to the fishery model, because that exactly fits this, okay? So at the moment, the left-hand side exceeds the right-hand side, and this is, of course, this is a statement of a particular point in time, say 2023, but of course, each of these things are part of a dynamical system. I'm not going to write that down. I have in the review, there are chapters in which I produce a complete capital model, which includes natural capital, to show how to think about forecasting of economic possibilities and conceiving economic possibilities, taking nature as essential. Now, the key thing here, and I'll be very brief because this is not the time to go into it in great detail. You might think, well, look, if there is inequality here, how do we close the gap? So if one wants to talk about sustainable development, the first cut must be to make that into an inequality, make it into an equality. Maybe even try and reverse it in order to let nature regenerate, investment in nature to regenerate. In any event, we can't allow that to. Now, this is what I've run some crude estimates of what would be required to hit the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. And the minimum requirement would be a closing of this gap, which was not in the Sustainable Development Goals. They didn't cast the goals in line with what I've given you here, this inequality. It turns out that alpha, under projections of global GDP that are consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, alpha would have to increase in this next 7 years at a percentage rate 5 times higher than it's ever been, at least in the last 30 years. It's not achievable. And in other words, the Sustainable Development Goals are misnamed because they're not directing attention at this critical inequality. Okay. But there are problems. Now, the final point I wanted to make about this is, so there are ways, and thinking about it would be, one obvious way would be to start investing in increasing alpha. So if you raise alpha somehow, then of course, given ceteris paribus, the left-hand side will be reduced. And of course, that's what the increasing alpha is, the mode of conduct in the economics of climate change, moving to more efficient methods of producing. Okay? All right. So, but there are problems within problems. So I want to end quickly, so give you a sense of the problem. If you were to look at the national, I've been looking at global issues, but the United Nations Environment Program, yes, has done a countrywide balance sheet over of the ecological footprint. Remember, the NY divided by alpha could be read as ecological footprint. I should have mentioned that, but that's the commonplace way of thinking about it, as a function of income. So we have now data from countrywide ecological footprints, which shows, not as expected, that ecological footprint per capita increases with income per capita. And this is, of course, national accounts, but I'll be thinking in terms of as persons. The problem is, again, this is not a subject for the faint-hearted. Everywhere there is a sort of a roadblock, is that it's strictly concave function, which means that there's a tension between sustainability and desire for equality. In other words, you will need to pay some more. You need to reduce GDP even more if you wish to both maintain an equality between demand and supply for nature's goods and processes and have greater equality. So there is a tension here. You can't. The reason is that while the rich certainly have a bigger footprint than the poor, at the margin, the richer households' footprint is lower than the poorer households, and that's what's causing it. Okay? So you can't have everything, so to speak. Okay. Now, the other, and I'll end with this. The other, there are some sample of global policies that I ought to mention, and I'll do that in the next minute and a half. So general policy, which the New York Times in a skit on my review called "Pay for what you use." And that's exactly right. The whole point is that the market prices are zero for, say, the oceans, ocean waters, and yet there's a positive shadow accounting prices. So the specific ones, I'll mention two: enforced charges for the use of the oceans, transportation of goods, pleasure cruises, mining, fishing, and polluting. There's this huge open access resource sitting out there, and it belongs to everybody. It's no countries. It's a global commons, and it's free of charge. Trillions of dollars of goods and merchandise are shipped across the oceans, so we should be able to generate some rent, the right to do that, to carry that transportation. That revenue, which could be in hundreds of billions annually, could be used for obviously standard development purposes and so forth, but a critical one that I tried to emphasize in my review and in many talks I've given is that it could be used to pay countries which house the rainforests, for example, tropical rainforests, for example, for preserving them. See, may seem crude, but they have a right to say, why should we be looking after the whole of humanity? Brazil would say, our rainforests are ours, and we need to develop. That's been the standard argument. Because while it benefits them to have it, the world enjoys, it's a global public good. They're global public good. So we need, within nations, of course, now the practice of payment for ecosystem services is becoming more and more commonplace. The UK has it extensively, paying farmers to do this, that, and the other. And my thought was that we should now have an international institution established to do precisely that. And I'll end with a slightly bitter note, but if you work on this kind of problem, which is so problematic, you need to have a cheerful frame of mind, bent of mind, so nothing really disturbs me too much. But I've had now about 250 meetings since my review was published, because there was a demand for it, to give Q&As, lectures, interviews, and this is one of the proposals that I emphasized. At every stage, international and decision makers, international organizations, political figures from a variety of countries said the world doesn't have an appetite for such an enterprise to establish such an institution. And I kept on pointing out that at the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Anthropocene, if you like, or predating the Anthropocene, Europe was in ruins, Far East was in ruins, and we created the United Nations, World Bank, IMF. These were all producing global public goods. The Marshall Plan, which was referred to, again, a global public action. But we now do not have the guts to save the planet. That, I think, is sad news. Thank you very much. Whatever. And there's, of course, dinner.
Yeah, so.
No, the drinks can't be postponed.
No, they certainly cannot.
That would be unthinkable.
We have some questions from over here.
Hello, Professor Dasgupta. Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to focus on one of the components of environmental degradation, which is consumption, which is especially relevant in rich countries. And I wanted to ask you, drawing on your own expertise and on the other talks, which also touched upon this relevant subject, how do you view, what are the prospects of reining in consumption, given the fact that it's not a purely private reflection of private preferences, but it's also socially embedded? And yes, that's it.
Well, look, I can't respond to your latter question, although I would love to be able to do that. It would be presumptuous of me to. I'm not a political scientist. All I know is that Cambridge, even a small problem like a congestion charge in a heavily congested, beautiful city like Cambridge, was rejected because people didn't like to be taxed. Okay, so that's the second part. First one, it's a very good question, because that's a very natural thing to do. You want to bring down the NY, if you like, somehow. And if you feel that's not going to happen, but at least conceptually you have a right to ask that question. If the rich are consuming so much as they are, because after all, the inequality is a fact. So the context of that, what can you do? Well, I did this calculation. If you were to halve the per capita GDP of the OECD countries, that's as the economist likes to call it, a club of rich nations. Let's say if you halve it, then other things remain the same. The 1.7 would be reduced to 1.3, but it'll still be positive. So that's not going to do all the work. The work has to be done in other ways. Raising alpha somehow, But alpha can't go to infinity. So the idea that you could have ny going to infinity while alpha goes to infinity, keeping the left-hand side finite and within bounds, that's not on. Because alpha going to infinity is equivalent to saying that asymptotically we can escape the biosphere. We can be free of it, asymptotically, at the margin. And since, well, I mean, Musk might think he can, but not we humans can't. So that's a problem. The other is, of course, to invest in S. That's green investment, if you like.
Thank you. I wonder if you could just comment. I can't help but just reminds me of sort of market externalities is the
Yes, of course.
degeneration, and so we need to internalize them through taxation or incentives to work on that. And that's a big sell that, as you said, in Cambridge, they weren't able to sell. But do you think your theoretical work will help sell that? And the second aspect is, although it's theory, do you see this having any impact on, say, benefit cost analysis of natural resource issues?
Very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, I know. Having said theory, I was acting as a sort of a blushing bride. I don't mean that. I'm rather proud to be a theorist. Without theory, applied work has no meaning, because you don't know what even evidence means. Okay, so you've got to get the theory right. That's for sure. I'm concentrating on theory because that's where my strength is. The review is 610 pages long, and there's a heck of a lot of applied material. So that's point number one. Point number two is that, yes, there is a good deal of work in shifting attention towards these issues that's been going on since the publication, and some movements were there even before. For example, most countries now, at least of the countries that I know of, are moving more and more towards creating natural capital accounts. Okay, UK has it. Now, it's not to supplement GDP, and it shouldn't either. GDP is extremely useful for short-run macroeconomic management, that's for sure. But I'm talking about long-term macroeconomics, long-term growth prospects, and so forth. So there it's happening. Most recently, of course, the United States itself has come up with a document coming from the White House, redirecting social cost benefit analysis to include nature services. It's not yet been published, but I endorsed it. I was asked to endorse it, and I have. So that's happening. Now, it's interesting, since you've asked, and I'll take half a minute, inclusive wealth might seem a new thing. It's not, because the way we evaluate projects is to look at the net present value of net flow of net benefits, okay? Social benefits, of course. But if you think about it, the discounted value of this flow of net benefits is a stock, because you're summing the flows. And it turns out that present value is in fact equal to the change in inclusive wealth that the project would bring forward. So if you accept the project because PV is positive, it means wealth is increasing. So yes, it's now a tidy theory in the sense that we now have a complete capital model to think about economic possibilities. One possibility, and I'll finish with that, because drink calleth, is alpha. I tend to think in terms of alpha, increasing alpha as technological improvements, and that's what the climate change economics has encouraged us to think. But of course, alpha has institutions built into it. So for example, suppose you could tax the oceans. Suppose you could then subsidize the holders of natural assets like the tropical rainforests. Then alpha would be increased because we'll be veering in a different direction, a different composition, different use of the assets that we hold, this asset management problem that we have. We'll be making natural capital more scarce, more valuable, more costly. So the direction of technological change will be one in which new technologies will be less rapacious in the use of nature. Because entrepreneurs have no reason to economize on nature because nature is free, cheap. You want to economize on labor. hence the chainsaw, hence the bulldozer and everything. Now, some years ago, Joe may have forgotten, Joe and I published a paper in which I think is the first and maybe even the only analytical paper, which showed how an economy could absolutely veer off in a different direction through technological change, but we used learning by doing as the trigger mechanism. Now, here, the insight there carries over to everything I've said. If the prices change, then incrementally, the direction of technological change will be altered. And over the long run, we will see a different world that we can't conceive now because what we see is what we have. And so the idea that, what do we do? What will the world be like if we actually charged or priced these unpriced assets? We don't know because we are far off from it. But if you believe in decentralization, if you believe there are incentives to carry the thing, and if the accounting prices are guiding in the right way, then it won't be a worse world, it'll be a far better world.
Thank you.